we are pleased that Colin Kelly, who is a member at Westminster, he is a new elder on session, is going to share with us share about his experience as a soldier in Iraq. And before he went, he prepared himself to try to understand his Muslim neighbors that he was going to be meeting there and understand their faith as best he could, to have as good of a rapport with them as possible. And I don't want to say any more because that'll be your story. But we welcome you and thank you for sharing your story with us. And I'd like to open us with a prayer. Would you join me in prayer? Gracious Lord, we give you praise for this glorious morning. Thank you for those who are gathered here, and thank you for Colin, who has tried so much to listen to the voice of his Lord, to understand and have good relationships with others in the world. We pray that our time together here will be blessed and that you will use the words that he has to share with us to grow us ever deeper in the way of Christ. And it is in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Pastor Jenny. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming today. Everybody hear me? I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience in Iraq. I think it's very relevant today. In fact, it's a lot more relevant today than I thought it would be when I initially left Iraq. And to some degree, that's unfortunate because of a lot of the things that we're hearing out of Iraq and the Middle East. One second. So it's a little bit unfortunate, given all the things that we keep hearing from the Middle East. And I just thought that if I could share my experience with all of you, you would have the opportunity to perhaps share your experience with others. Here we go. Hit stop. Hit stop. Check. Check. I think that one's better. So thank you for allowing me to come to share my experience. So I thought that this first picture was apropos for today's discussion. That was a family that I met when I was in Iraq. I got to Iraq in 2004, and I was there for approximately a year, 2004 to 2005. I got there when hostilities were at their height. The insurgency was in full swing. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was fully established. We had terrorists coming in from Syria and from the broader Middle East. And my unit got there a bit unprepared for what we were going to experience. But despite all of the hostilities and despite all of the violence that I witnessed over there were opportunities to actually meet Iraqi Muslims, and there were opportunities to get to know them and share my experience, as someone from the United States, and hear their experience as Muslims. So this is one of the families who was very open to talking to me and getting to know soldiers. I would say that they were pretty open-minded. Again, they were Muslims. They strongly believed in Islam. They strongly believed in the teachings of Muhammad. And yet they were interested to hear about my faith as a Christian. They were interested to hear about who I was. And they invited me into their home. You can imagine inviting a soldier into your home who, you can't see it there, but I had a weapon hanging off my shoulder. I've got a helmet on. So there was an element of trust that I was able to establish with this family, irrespective of everything that was going on in Iraq. So this is my agenda for today. Tried to divide the presentation up into 4 sections. What I'll do is I'll go through each section for about 10 minutes, and then I'll leave about 5 minutes for questions, just so if things come to mind, you'll have an opportunity just to ask me, and we can have a dialogue and a discussion. So first section is really just my preparation for the deployment to Iraq. as you can imagine, I was pretty nervous when I was going to Iraq, and in order to calm some of the nerves that I felt, I thought, I should really understand the history of this region. I should really understand, everybody who I'm going to meet. I should understand Islam. I drew some key insights about Iraq that I think helped me when I went into Iraq. They helped me establish some of those relationships with local Iraqis because they were happy to hear that I understood their culture. They were happy to hear that I wanted to reach out to them and understand them. And because of that, they wanted to understand me a little bit better. So I was able to break down a barrier at a small level. Obviously peace hasn't broken out in Iraq since I've been there. That would have been my wish, but maybe we'll get there someday. I'll talk about the current situation in Iraq, Syria, and the Middle East. I think that would be of paramount interest to everyone here. I'll just talk about the new landscape and what it means for the United States and us in the West. And then I'll close with what I think a conversation between Jesus Christ and Muhammad would be. When I was in Iraq, we had chaplains that were over there, and they would counsel us all the time. And they said that soldiers are like monks, and we are very reflective on our lives because we spend all of this time away from our family. We spend times in solitude. We spend a lot of time training. So because of that, we really get to know ourselves. And I had a lot of time to think about what Christ would say to Muhammad and what Muhammad would say to Christ. And is there a way that those two could understand each other? And I think at the end you'll see that I think that there is a way that they could understand each other. However, there are some fundamental disagreements that both Christ and Muhammad would have that are very clear, and they're written in the Quran, and I'll point those out today. So I'll start off with my unit. I was in the 2nd Infantry Division, 1st and 506th Infantry, based in South Korea. This is 2004. I went to South Korea in 2002, so I lived there for approximately 2 years. I was on the demilitarized zone. So from where I lived, right there, in that lovely building, which was a mess. I think it was built in the Korean War, so really not the happiest place to live. I actually lived in the utility closet because there wasn't room for me when I got there. So I had to clean out this whole utility closet. I put a cot in there. I actually found a branch outside that I hung from the ceiling with some rope so I could hang my clothes up. So that was my living as a 2nd lieutenant. So anybody who thinks that being an officer in the military is, all about glory, it's not at all. But if I stepped out of my house here, I could see the North Korean flag. So that's about how close I was to North Korea. So we would run a lot of different missions on the demilitarized zone, really just to let the North Koreans know that we were there. And if they ever feel as though they wanted to come down to South Korea, they would have to deal with not only the South Koreans, but they would also have to deal with the United States. So in 2004, early 2004, Donald Rumsfeld met with General Laporte in Korea. And Donald Rumsfeld had a basic question for him. He said, why is it that you have forces that are so close to the demilitarized zone? We think it's dangerous. We think that you need to pull those forces back from the demilitarized zone. So General Laporte said, well, we have a real-world mission here. We really have to make sure that we're fortified up on the demilitarized zone. So I really like to keep the troops there. And Donald Rumsfeld said, well, I've got this great idea. We're going to take your whole division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and we're going to send them over to Iraq. So that was his solution for how to deal with the problem that we were having in South Korea. So in 2004, we got deployment orders to go to Iraq. A lot of soldiers had already been in Korea for a year to 2 years, and now they just learned that they would be in Iraq for an additional year, potentially more at the time. Thankfully, it only ended up being 1 year, but we thought that it could have gone as long as 18 months. So to add to how tense the situation was, my unit was an air assault unit. So we were trained to get into helicopters. Helicopters would fly us to an area. We would get out of the helicopters. We would walk wherever we needed to go. And then we would get back on the helicopters and go home. So when we went to Iraq, we didn't have a need for helicopter insertions. We actually had a need for mobile infantry. So they changed our unit from an air assault unit to a mobile infantry unit, and we had to train to be a mobile infantry unit within 2 months before we went to Iraq. So we had pretty intense training in Korea, which is kind of a wet area. It's, it's hot in summers. It's got 4 seasons. In Iraq, it's a desert. So I wouldn't say that we were as prepared as we could have been or should have been when we went to Iraq. So then that's me right there on the right. That's my company commander, Tom Kim, and my first sergeant Rodriguez. So that was taken when we first got to Iraq. You'll notice in all of these pictures that I'm smiling. I'm sharing all of my happy pictures. So wanted to make sure that you saw those. So essentially, flew from Korea to Thailand. Then I flew from Thailand to Kuwait. And then I convoyed up to Ramadi, Iraq. It took us about 4 days to convoy up to Ramadi. We actually had to drive from Kuwait up all the way around Baghdad, and then back to the west, and then all the way around Ramadi to settle right between Ramadi and Fallujah. The reason why we had to take such a circuitous route is because none of the roads to get up there were safe. So the only safe roads were the ones that were out in the middle of the desert. So we couldn't go through the cities. It was just too dangerous to go through the cities because of all of the bombs that were on the rise at the time. So when I got the deployment orders, I decided that I really want to understand what Iraq is all about. I want to understand what is going on here. I want to understand Islam. I want to understand Muslims, and I want to understand why the United States is going here, and are the plans that we currently have, are they the correct ones to have? So I first realized that, I'm going to the Fertile Crescent. I'm going to the birthplace of civilization. So that's an opportunity. So despite the circumstances, here, I'm going to an area that, has such a place in the history of humanity. My unit was actually stationed right about there, right on the Euphrates River. So my camp was right on the Euphrates River. So I remember waking up in the morning and looking out and saying, "My goodness, this is the Euphrates River. This is in the Bible. This is great. I'm so happy that I'm able to see this in my lifetime." Then I realized that this area was the center of conflict for thousands of years. And it was the center of conflict for a number of reasons. First, it was the center of a lot of the world's religions, where the world's religions were born. Christianity was born in this area, Judaism was born in this area, Islam was born in this area. Then there were a number of sects. Even within Islam, you have Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam, and there's a lot of conflict between those two for a lot of reasons that I'll get in momentarily. Then I realized that Iraq is also strategically located from a trade perspective. In order to get to India, and in order to get to Russia, in order to get to Europe and England, the primary land route is through Iraq. So Baghdad actually became the center of learning and the center of commerce during the golden years of Islam. Algebra, it actually comes from an Arabic word, al-jabr. So algebra was actually founded or created by Muslims. So I started to realize that there's so much going on here. I can understand why there's a lot of conflict. And then I realized that over the last 2 millennia, there has always been conflict in this area. It's not that the United States decided to get involved in the Middle East for oil. There has always been involvement in the Middle East for all of the reasons that I just mentioned. The Ottoman Turks were involved in this area. The British East India Company was involved in this area. Great Britain, England was involved in this area. You had the Mongols from China ended up becoming involved in this area. So I realized that I was just the latest part of the latest group that decided to go into Iraq and try to do something. So if you look up in the left-hand corner, that's me. So given all of the preparation that I did in Iraq, I would talk to my soldiers every day and try to explain Islam and try to explain why all these things are going on and what our role is. And I wanted to give them as much context as I could so that as they were going out into cities and fighting, we were an infantry unit, so anywhere we were sent there to fight. We weren't sent there to be diplomats. But we still had to be diplomats to a degree because we were the only people who were interfacing with all of the local Iraqis. The real diplomats weren't armed. They couldn't come into these areas. They were a vulnerable target. So U.S. soldiers were tasked with being not only combatants, but also diplomats. So we had to be pretty skilled in how we interacted with the community. We had to be pretty skilled in who we aligned ourselves with. We tried to align ourselves with the insurgents at the time. We felt that the insurgents in Iraq were no different than people from the United States. We were revolutionaries. So the insurgents, we felt, had a legitimate claim. They don't want a foreign power in their country. We understood that. So if they fought us because they didn't want us there, we were accepting of that, and we actually tried to make friends with them. Guys, we're very much alike. We have similar views. Why don't we help each other out? And while I was there, we started to see a lot of that success. So people who would be classified as insurgents started to come over to our side because they saw that we're trying to help them out. We don't want to fight you. We don't want us to have hostilities between us. Then they started, those insurgents, as we became friends with them, they started to tell us about all of the terrorists that were coming in from Syria and other terrorists that were coming in from Iran. And people who really wanted destruction for anybody who didn't accept their brand of Islam. So we got a lot of intelligence to find out where these people were, and then we were able to target our missions a lot better, and we were able to stay away from a lot of the population. And ultimately, we started to win over the local population. They started to help us out a lot. So as I explained all of these dynamics to my soldiers, we were actually out on a mission one day on probably the most dangerous road in Iraq. It's called Route Michigan. There are books that have been written about this. It's basically a road that goes from Baghdad in kind of the central part of Iraq, west through Fallujah, then it goes west through Ramadi, and then west all the way out to Syria. So we had terrorists that were coming in back and forth on that route. So we would continuously have skirmishes with those people. So as I would explain all of these things to my soldiers, they would go out in these areas. They would make friends with a lot of the local people, and then they became friends with some store owners. And they thought, hey, Captain Kelly knows a lot about Islam. He knows a lot about Muslims. Let's buy some stuff. So that's what they did. They bought all of this, Arabic garb and brought it back, to our camp and said, "Hey, sir, we really want you to put this on because we think you really fit in here." I was like, "Guys, I fit in everywhere. What are you talking about?" So this gentleman's name is George. George was a Shiite interpreter that we had. We became pretty good friends with him, and he asked me, how do I want to look? Do I want to look like an elitist sheikh, or do I want to look like a countryside Bedouin? And I was like, countryside Bedouin. So that's what he dressed me up as. So that was just an opportunity for us to have a little bit of an interaction and have a good laugh. And so all of my soldiers were hysterical about this. That's why they were taking pictures of me. So I thought that, who am I like? I'm like Sir Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence. I was happy that I'm kind of falling into this historic timeline here, and I think I tried to have the same understanding of Muslims that T.E. Lawrence did. So we got to Iraq. Obviously we saw a lot of minarets, a lot of mosques. Interesting thing about Korea and Iraq, you would think that there would be no similarities between these two areas, but there's one I can tell you. In Korea, in the demilitarized zone, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the North Koreans would start blasting all of their propaganda, and it would wake me up every morning. Even before the United States Army was awake to do physical fitness, they started this stuff. I think deliberately. Then when I got to Iraq, mosques called a prayer. It was at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, why does everybody wake up so early? In the United States, 7:30, 8-ish is kind of where I'm at. But then I discovered that where we ended up in my unit, and we actually landed in a town called Habbaniyah, which is right between Ramadi and Fallujah. It's right on the Euphrates River, so that is a picture of the Euphrates. You'll notice that the pictures that I have of the Euphrates River aren't necessarily panoramic. And that's the reason for that is I took this picture right at the edge of our camp. So not really the safest area to be, so I kind of ran up there, took a quick picture, and ran back just to make sure I had it. So when I started to study Islam, I realized that within Islam there is a schism. And we as Christians have experienced schisms throughout our history. We had the Great Schism in the Church of England, with the Church of England. We had the Protestant Reformation. So we understand that as Christians, we can be a bit divided. Well, the same type of divisions exist with Islam, and they're split between Sunnis and Shiites. The biggest reason why there's a split between Sunnis and Shiites believe that Muhammad's cousin Ali is the rightful imam, the rightful leader of all of Islam. And they believe that only his family members should be leaders of Islam. So they don't recognize anybody who isn't part of that lineage. So I would say that the Shiites are, the Iraqis told me that the Shiites would be the equivalent of Catholics in the United States. Shiites would be the equivalent of Catholics in the United States. And the reason for that is Catholics have a lot of deep traditions. They have a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of formalities. That's what the Shiites have. The Shiites have that, and it's viewed as kind of a bit kitschy. Why do you need all of this? The Sunnis, on the other hand, believe that as long as you adhere to the teachings of Islam in their purest form, you are allowed to be a leader of Islam. So they don't mind having people that don't necessarily have a direct lineage to Muhammad or his family. So that's the reason why you have that key divide. So you'll notice here that I have a red line that's drawn through Iraq. To the west of that red line, those are all predominantly Sunnis. To the east and southeast of that red line, those are predominantly Shiites. Iran is 99% Shiite. So Iran, even though they're not Arabs, they're Persian, they are Muslims, but they are Shiite Muslims, and they have an allegiance to the Shiites of Iraq. So there's a pretty strong relationship between the Shiites here, led by Muqtada al-Sadr, and Iran. In the West, you have the Sunnis, and right now with ISIS, ISIS is really a Sunni brand of Islam, and they are trying to consolidate Sunni power in that area. If you look at the rest of the Middle East, Syria is Sunni, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, all of the other areas of the Middle East are all Sunni. So the Shiites are actually viewed as minorities. They're viewed as inferior. They're mistreated, typically everywhere they go. They live in small bands to protect each other from oppressive Sunnis and anybody else who would oppress them. So I would say that they are the ones who consistently throughout history have borne the brunt of a lot of unnecessary hostilities. So I realized that in Baghdad is the dividing line between those two sects. And my unit ended up right in Baghdad. So as I flew out there, I realized, this was the key discovery that I made, we are right in the center of where all of the problems are. And I didn't feel that our government at the time necessarily understood that. I think that we view everything as through a nationalistic lens as Americans. We have a strong identification with the country of the United States. Muslims have a strong identification with their religion and their particular brand of their religion. They don't have any allegiance to Iraq or Iran or any of the dividing lines that are in the Middle East. They're meaningless to them. So we went in there looking at Muslims in Iraq as though they were Iraqis, and they should have a nationalistic pride. So, of course, voting and democracy is great for them. Everybody wants that. But that's not what they want. They want security. They want to be able to practice their own religion. They want freedom from oppression. They want freedom from violence. That's really all they want. So we were trying this experiment to introduce democracy. And while all of the local Iraqis were helping us out, They were interested in what democracy was, and they actually voted. You saw the people who had the glue on their finger to say, hey, look, I voted. They really didn't care. It was all for show. And they just thought of us as kind of the latest people who have ended up in Iraq. So I saw this misunderstanding, and I thought, well, like it or not, we are always going to be involved in this region. We're going to be involved here because of oil. We're going to be involved here because there are people who don't like us, who want to attack us. We are going to be involved here because all of our competitors in the world, Russia, have gotten involved in this area. So we have no choice but to be involved in this area. So I asked myself, how can we be involved effectively? And how can we understand the Muslims that live here? How can we be respectful of what they're going through, and how can we help them to kind of emerge as their own leaders with us in the background? So I'll stop there. Are there any questions so far?
Did you ever feel frustrated that the United States, the powers that we were making these decisions, didn't understand the personality of the Iraqis?
I did. So not only did I feel frustration with our politicians, at the time, and I understand their perspective. We were attacked. They're trying to figure out the Middle East. They were in a reactive mode, not really in a planning mode where they can do things clearly. So I understand that. The frustration that I had locally in Iraq, dealing with all of my commanders, I would give this feedback to my commanders. My commanders were all mission focused. Look, this is our division's mission, Colin. This is our battalion's mission. This is your company mission. Just execute the mission. We're happy that you've studied all of this, and we're happy that it's helping you be effective. But just execute the mission. Now that said, I executed the mission, in exactly the way I was trained to. But I also understood that I could be more effective if I just went out and talked to some of the Iraqis. I could get some intelligence that other people couldn't, simply because people recognized me as somebody who was approachable. It was recognized when I got out of Iraq. I was actually given all high fives when I left. Hey, great job executing the mission. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, I executed the mission, but the fact that I understood so deeply all of this stuff that was going on enabled me to be effective. And I think a lot of soldiers that were over there had the same viewpoint. So we all tried to be as effective as we could, given our mission constraints and given what we were dealing with while we were in Iraq. In the end, the situation was the situation. So yeah, there was a lot of frustration. I'd like to think that there was a little good that came out of it. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
It sounds like your explorations into the culture was self-initiated. Didn't any of that come from your commanders? Like, this is what you should know before you're going?
They tried. But I guess the way I would put it, the education was catered toward high school students, students who, either they didn't graduate from high school or they got a GED. So some of our soldiers weren't really the type that would initiate any intellectual pursuit. They were really just there to do their job. These are the types of people who wanted to be mechanics. They wanted to be plumbers. They wanted to be more of the worker types. And this kind of stuff it's just not what they're interested in. So what we ended up having was training that was cultural, like how not to offend. For example, if you take your right hand and put it on your heart, that means you're friendly, you're trying to show respect. If you use your left hand, if you wave, that could offend some. So there's more cultural things that we were taught, and that we taught a lot of our soldiers. And it was just for to get them through the daily interactions with Iraqis. It really wasn't so that they understood all of these cultural things that were going on. I think maybe some of the more senior enlisted, some of the officers were a little bit more proactive in just learning on their own.
You explained that the Shiites are more like Catholics, or perhaps not so divided as perhaps the Sunnis, which have the whole spectrum from the
is. And the reason for that division is you have the adherents to Islam and those who believe that the Quran and Sharia law should be what governs people. But then you also have the secularists, which are part of the Ba'ath Party. So the Ba'ath Party actually tried to separate themselves from all of the religious fundamentalists, and they wanted to implement more of a secular government that they thought would be more effective. But it hasn't been effective because they've never been able to get the support of the fundamentalists for that type of a government. So in the United States, we believe in separation of church and state. In the Middle East, and especially with Muslims, they believe that the church is the state. So if you were trying to create a state outside of Islam, you're doing something that is fundamentally against God. So the Ba'athists are viewed that way. So there will always be a battle between the Ba'athists, which are a secular political party, and the Sunnis, who are more fundamental in nature.
Well, weren't the Wahhabis essentially in control of the Sunnis for a long time?
They were. I mean, they're kind of an extreme sect. And there are really two sources of Islamic thought. One is the Quran and the other is the Hadith. So the Quran is supposed to have come directly from God. It was actually the word of God that God spoke directly to Muhammad. The Hadith is Muhammad's own words, just how he thinks Islam should be given to the community. So there are a lot of his own thoughts on governments and how to interact with each other that come directly from him. As I get to the end, I think I'll demonstrate that that's where some of the problems I think are coming from. It's coming from the not necessarily from the Quran.
Well, there's a lot of blood relationship between the Sunnis in Iraq and Saudi.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Very close.
Yeah. The House of Saud, they are very influential in the area.
They're close cousins.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jen?
It sounds like a lot of your education process was self-initiated. I'm just curious, how and where did you find resources to teach yourself and learn?
Jeff Bezos from Amazon. I literally just went to Amazon and just started looking up books. And then with all of the books that I read, I would look at the credibility of the author, what his academic credentials were. I wanted to make sure that I didn't get anything that was slanted in either direction. I wanted something that was a pure view and an objective view. And then after I got the objective view, then I sought out things that were a little bit more biased, just to see if I was missing anything. So after I was confident in the credibility of the authors, I'd then buy the book and then read the book and talk to other Muslim friends that I had in the United States just to get their feedback as well. Discovery Channel had a lot of different documentaries on Islam, so I watched a number of them.
Weren't you working as a soldier at the time?
Well, I was, yeah. This is in my, so you have a lot of downtime as a soldier. It's called hurry up and wait. So, we always had to be, there like 3 hours early. It was the formation for the formation's formation. So I had all this extra time on my hands just to read books. Other questions?
Colin, what exactly was the mission, your mission, your unit's mission? Can you talk to that?
Yeah, so when I got to Iraq, Fallujah had just fallen, so the Marines lost Fallujah. The Marines also lost Ramadi at the time. Now I was an Army guy, so I'm going to hit the Marines a little bit. But I was actually part of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force. So the reason why they lost Ramadi in Iraq is there were a lot of, I would say, less experienced units that were sent over there, National Guard units, reserve units. So when we realized that we were having such problems in this area, the generals decided to send in kind of a crack infantry unit to go in and use a little bit of force, to get control of the areas. So it was really my job to go in and halt the insurgency. Then it was to make friends with the insurgency after we halted them, and then it was to find the terrorists who were under al-Zarqawi at the time. So it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So we did a lot of cordon and searches, cordon and knocks, looking for al-Zarqawi.
Colin, can you talk a little bit about the timeline of when Islam was created, and then also when the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis
Sure.
became very evident?
It's a great question. That's the direction that we're going. So that'll be the next section. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so Muhammad was born in the 600s. He was born after Jesus Christ died. So he knew of Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ's mission. He recognized that Christ was a prophet. Muhammad didn't believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God or the Son of Man. He didn't believe that Christ was divine. He did believe that Christ was a prophet there to do the same mission. He viewed Christ as a miracle worker. Although Muhammad was not a miracle worker, he would tell you that his only miracle that he produced was the Quran. That's it. Outside of that, he just implemented a form of governance and worship and piety that allowed Islam to flourish. What happened was, as Muhammad started to gain power in Mecca, all of the locals in that area became threatened by his message. They became threatened by how influential he started to become. The reason why they felt threatened is because at the time they were polytheistic, they were not monotheistic. So there was a threat to who the gods were that they worshipped, that those gods would likely go away. And those are the gods they worshipped in order to make sure that their businesses and all the commerce that they had was going well. So their entire world was changing under Muhammad. So as a result of those threats, Muhammad had to flee to Medina, which is to the north of Mecca. When he fled, it's actually called a hijra. And the hijra is his flight to Mecca, and his flight to Medina, and Medina is actually the city where Islam was founded and flourished. Muhammad's message grew stronger, and he attracted a lot of followers in Medina, and he was able to build an army. The army existed really to protect him from all of the factions that were trying to kill him and hurt him and hurt his new message. When he grew big enough, he became a lot more proactive, and he took his army and attacked Mecca. So he regained control of Mecca at the time, and that is when Islam flourished. Throughout that period, it is said that Muhammad met God in the cave, or he met the angel Gabriel in the cave. And the angel Gabriel said, God has a message for you, and he wants to tell you what the Quran is. So over a 23-year period of his life, Muhammad received messages from God that became what is today the Quran. When Muhammad died, there was a power struggle between all of the initial followers. There were actually 12 followers. So very similar to Jesus. Christ had 12 apostles, Muhammad had 12 followers. Those followers started to fight each other for control. And there was only one of them that had a direct relationship to Muhammad, which is Ali. It was his cousin and brother-in-law. So it was viewed that Ali should be the rightful next leader. But there were others who felt that that wasn't the case because they wanted a more strict interpretation of the Quran. So that's where that first divide happened. Now, over that time period, there was a little bit of unity. Islam began to grow, and it began to become a little bit more imperialistic. So it started to attack some of the areas around it. So Persia was one of the first. So it attacked Persia, it ultimately overtook Persia, and then that is when the Persians ceased being Zoroastrians at the time, and then became Muslims. So they abandoned their own religion for Islam. So Islam started to grow, grew even more under Saladin the Great. So Saladin was a great military commander. And he is actually, I would say that he is probably one of the reasons why there is a lot of tension even today in the Middle East. He became so expansionist that Islam grew all over the area that he started to threaten Europe. So at the time, you've heard of the Crusades. The Crusaders under King Richard the Lionheart under the Third Crusade actually went into the Middle East to fight Saladin to stop his advance. So So this is where a lot of those battles really began. So when you talk to a lot of Muslims, they will say that it's the Crusades. The Crusades are the reason why there is this divide between Christians and Muslims. And I would disagree. And the reason why I would disagree is there were two factions that were basically playing the same game. They were both imperialistic. They were both using religion as their justification for their imperialistic behavior. Okay, so to me, they were all playing by the same rules. I think the real problems occurred in Islam when Mamghay Khan, who is a grandchild of Genghis Khan, actually came in and sacked Baghdad viciously. So that occurred, kind of in 1258, right before Khan was no longer in power. So Baghdad was the center of Islamic learning. It was the center of what is considered the golden age of Islam. The Mongols, as they were, when they fought, not only did they fight to win militarily, but they fought to take somebody's heart and soul. That's what they did. So they knew that Baghdad was that heart and soul of Islam, so they came in and just sacked Baghdad unceremoniously. So as a result of that, I think that had a huge impact on the thinking, on Islamic thinking at the time, because they weren't strong enough to defend themselves from such a strong enemy. So that's where a lot of these problems really originated. After that time period, leading all the way up to the 1900s, the Ottoman Turks took over the area, and they organized the entire Middle East. So they were not only good at government administration, they were more secular in nature, so they started to abandon some of the ideas of Islamic thought. So they grew, and ultimately they were able to hold the area and control the area. But then in the 1900s, around Sir Lawrence of Arabia, you had an Arabic movement that was very much unsatisfied with the Ottomans. So as a result of that, guys like T.E. Lawrence went in and actually helped the Arabs, the ones who we are now fighting today. We were actually their allies back then, against the Ottomans, and we actually helped push their cause forward. What happened was the Ottomans, under Mehmed V, I'm not sure if I'm saying that name correctly, he was one of the final leaders of the Ottoman Empire. He made an alliance with Germany in World War I. When Germany ultimately lost in World War I, that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. And then what is now Constantinople, Turkey, Turkey took over and became a lot more powerful after that. So now we have what has become our understanding of the modern-day Middle East, where we have Turkey, who's a powerful force, we have Saudi Arabia, who's a powerful force, we have Iran, who's a powerful force, and kind of right down the center we have a hodgepodge of Ba'athist ideals, fundamentalist Islam, Sunni Islam, Shiite Islam. That's the reason why we now have all the problems that we have today. I'll stop there. Any questions right now?
You missed a big period, the second jihad.
The Second Crusade? I did, and I think it was just for the matter of time. There were a number of different crusades, but essentially the Crusades.
Because the Ottoman Empire really grew, well, what became the Ottoman Empire, all the Moors.
Correct. Correct. I think that there were. I think in Laura's class, you mentioned the missionaries. The Crusades, were one of their purposes was to actually protect missionaries, who were going to whatever Christian missions that they had. So, the Crusades were kind of, a lot of variations on the same theme. The reason why I highlighted this past area is because I think that was the decisive one. That's where everything really changed. That's where the whole landscape changed. But you're exactly right. Any other questions?
I have a comment. I think it's noteworthy during the Ottoman Empire that the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims had a fairly peaceful period of time. It was because of what you mentioned, the governance skill that the Ottoman Empire had. Their neighborhoods were integrated, they got along extremely well together. And so we went through a cycle, a whole bunch of cycles where there was peace in the Middle East in general.
Right. And I think one of the reasons for that was the Ottoman Empire. I think another reason for that was the way Muhammad and his followers preached Islam. So they let everyone know that Abraham is really their father. Abraham is everybody's father. He's the father of Christianity. He's the father of Judaism. He's the father of Islam. So we're all cousins. We're all part of the same family. We just have different interpretations of how to worship. When I get to the end, I'll talk about just my interpretation of the Quran. The Quran is to me, the final statement of God. We had the Old Testament, and then we had the New Testament with Jesus Christ. When you read the Quran, it's almost a recounting of all of the prophets that have come before Muhammad. And Muhammad talks about all of them, all the way up to Jesus Christ, and talks about how significant they were. So because he showed that respect to all of these other religions, the other religions were able to live peacefully. This is a lesson that I think I would give to a lot of modern day imams, that this is what Muhammad did. You could be doing the same thing, and Christians should do the same thing as well. This is an area where we can really understand each other. Is there another question?
You then comment on the role of the European powers after the Ottomans fell, and sort of the land grabs. Well, we can only take this, and France will take this, and so on. Which also plays into these situations.
Yeah, a lot of that was due to the discovery of oil. Again, there were business reasons why those decisions were made. So, England at the time, took their positions in the Middle East. And then there was a struggle. I didn't get into the history too much. Iraq, how Saddam Hussein came to control, or came to power, but he came to power through the Ba'ath Party. And the impetus of that was oil that started really in this time frame. Any other questions? So this is where we are today. These are the leaders right now who have the most impact in the Middle East. On the top left, this is the new king of Saudi Arabia, Salman bin Abdulaziz. He just replaced his brother. Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, and also a member of the Ba'ath Party. I would say that Assad right now is the last holdout for what the Ba'ath Party was intended to be, even though he's a pretty violent individual for people who don't see things his way. In Iran, you have Ali Khamenei. He's the religious leader and the supreme leader of Iran. He is his lineage, and he wanted Iran to be an Islamic state. So he actually tried to implement changes in Iran to make it an Islamic state where Shia Islam flourished in the area. And I think so far it has. I think that Iran is fairly organized as compared to other areas in the Middle East. The lower left, this is our favorite nowadays, the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He's an Iraqi Sunni cleric. So again, this is where the Sunni divide happens. And on the right-hand side, you have Muqtada al-Sadr. He is a Shiite cleric and head of the Mahdi army. So he is in Sadr City, which is very close to Baghdad. When I was in Iraq, Muqtada al-Sadr was a very vocal opponent of the United States at the time. He's now a big supporter of the United States. What's interesting is that where I was in Iraq, I dealt with all of Baghdadi's people. Where some of my friends were in Iraq, they dealt with Muqtada al-Sadr. So the strategies were different, the culture was different, and talking to them about some of our experiences, it's amazing to see the divergence of how our experiences were. So the reason why this new landscape is important. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all the smaller countries in this area are becoming less influential. They're becoming less influential because they're disorganized. They're becoming less influential because they don't have as much oil revenue as some of the other countries. Because of that, they don't have the influence and power as the other countries. So because their influence is diminishing, and because the United States and other powers have been involved, that have kind of halted their influence in the region, both Saudi Arabia and Iran have grown in power. And there are a lot who would say that it is this vacuum that was created that has given rise to these two, and there's an implication that that's a bad thing, and I would say that's probably a good thing. Only because these are the only two governments who have demonstrated that they are at least capable of organizing themselves and keeping people generally safe and generally happy. To a degree, they are violent. To a degree, they are oppressive. But there is stability in both of those regimes, and at least the people in those regimes are accepting of how they are being governed. So I thought that it would probably be a good thing if the Iranians would expand their borders a little bit and bring some of the Shiite Muslims that are in Iraq under their fold. And I think that would be a good thing if Saudi Arabia would do the same thing on the other side of Iraq. It's a little bit more difficult for Saudi Arabia to reach Syria. Syria is kind of off to the north. You've got Jordan in the middle. But I think Saudi Arabia can exert a lot more influence than they have. And it seems to me that under new leadership, they may exert a little bit more influence.
Well, that's because they own Medina.
That's right. Yep. They own Medina, they own Mecca. Yep. Absolutely.
And the ruler of those two places has an awful lot.
Yep. So now we're dealing with, the ISIS issue. And the counterbalance to ISIS is actually Muqtada al-Sadr. So ISIS, even though they've gained power and they've gained ground, you'll notice that they have stopped in Baghdad. They haven't gone further. The reason why they haven't gone further is because a fight with the Mahdi army is not what they want. Because if they start fighting the Mahdi army, immediately that will bring Iran into the conflict. So I just want to give you confidence that there is a little bit of a check and a balance on ISIS. ISIS, however, is very sophisticated in the way they deal with social media, in the way they execute some of their terrorist operations, in the way they share that with the world. So they are winning the war, the psychological war, to a degree. But I can tell you that they can't reach the United States. They can inspire violence within the United States, and they have. And they're trying to do that. And the FBI and we in the United States are trying to combat that. But they are not really as powerful as people think that they are. They're just butchers. They're just violent people who get a lot of attention. If they go too far, Muqtada al-Sadr will come in and fight. Another check is al-Assad. So I know that we don't view al-Assad as a particularly nice guy. He's a pretty violent guy. He's pretty oppressive in Syria. But he is, in fact, a check on ISIS. So despite the fact that we have two really violent people, they are a check on each other. Muqtada al-Sadr, I really would say protect his people, and he will do it vigorously. I don't see him aggressively trying to murder people or do things that would make the world community perceive him as being anything like ISIS and the bad part. So one would say, well, wow, why shouldn't we develop a relationship with Muqtada al-Sadr? The reason for that is we always try to develop these relationships in the Middle East. We always try to support somebody who we think is on our side. That person dies, a new person takes over. It's never effective to get involved. So I think what we need to do is contain this area a little bit more and not be so aggressive in going into the area, because really we don't have the ability to sort this out. I don't think anybody has the ability to sort all of this out except for probably God himself. So this is something that we are not going to be able to influence. All we can do is contain it and try to keep it from getting to our shores and try to protect our interests. Any questions on that?
Abu Bakr, where was he back in the early, you guys were in there, you know what, was he at all involved in any, you know about him at that time?
He was a prisoner, at the time.
He was a prisoner?
Yeah, and that was where, he was able to get a lot of or gain a lot of the influence that he received. So he became pretty influential in that area. I would say that it wasn't prison who created him. He was like this before he went to prison. Prison gave him a little bit more motivation to get involved. But at the time, we didn't know him. We knew all the names of the people who were a threat to us, but at the time we didn't view him as the person who we needed to focus on. Focus while I was over there was Al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda.
So it sounds like your thinking today is that our mission should be one of containment and keeping the Persian Gulf open, right? I was at a little seminar on Tuesday, and he is a retired colonel who does consulting in the Middle East, and he went through a lot of not so much on the religious side, but a lot of the history. And his three options were: we go in and take it over, we get out completely, or we have a containing force to try to contain what we can, keep the Persian Gulf open with the Fifth Fleet, and that's all we do. It sounds like you would lean towards that approach.
I would. Yeah, only because I just don't think we can be effective.
Right.
I would say that you get points for bravery
Right.
If you're going in, but I don't think that we would have the outcome that we want. Any other questions? So I'll close with what I think a conversation between Jesus Christ and Muhammad would be. Again, this is just my opinion. You can draw whatever conclusions that you want. I'm going to intersperse some facts from the Quran that I've read. But on the upper left-hand corner, obviously, symbol of Christianity. On the right-hand side, you have the crescent moon, which is a symbol of Islam. You have the Quran on the bottom right, and the Bible on the bottom. That's actually the Hebrew Bible. It's not the New Testament. I just picked that picture because it was the coolest looking. I thought it kind of matched this, But if Muhammad met Jesus, I think Muhammad would be very respectful of who Jesus was. In the Quran, there is one surah. A surah is a section, of the Quran. There is one surah called the Feast, and in the Feast, Muhammad explains the virgin birth, and he talks about Mary, and he validates that experience that Mary had, and basically said that this is something that we should all believe, because Mary truly gave birth to a very significant prophet who was a holy man and had a direct relationship with God as Muhammad did. So it was nice to read the Quran and see that Christianity is addressed throughout the entire Quran. Not only is Christianity addressed, but there's a lot of talk of Moses. There's a lot of talk of all of the different prophets, all the way up to Abraham. And Muhammad considers himself the seal of the prophets, the final prophet. That's what all Muslims consider him as well. They don't consider him a miracle worker. They don't consider him divine. In fact, they would say that it is wrong to consider a human divine. What Muhammad would say also to Jesus is that you are not the Son of Man. You are not the Son of God. You are not divine. You are a prophet just like I. I thought about what Christ's response would be to that. And I think what Christ would say is, I am a prophet, but I was given a gift to heal. I was given a gift to use all of these miracles to turn non-believers into believers. So he did have divine powers that Muhammad didn't. So I think right there, Christ would draw a distinction and say, he did actually have some divine powers that were given him from God. I don't know if Muhammad would agree with that. I think he might be a little bit frustrated by the answer. I think that Christ would view Muhammad as a lot more militant than Christ was. Now, Christ had a very aggressive political message. What he stood for provoked all of the political powers of the time, and he did it intentionally to provoke and to challenge them. But that was kind of an aggressive tact in the way that you would see from Martin Luther King. He was somebody who just challenged the thinking of the time, and people found that threatening. And then Christ submitted himself to the people who attacked him and said, go ahead and take it, because I am the Son of God. And Christ went through that death, in my opinion, to show us a model of what Christianity should be and what our own death should be. Ultimately, as long as you ask forgiveness, you try to align yourself with God, the kingdom of heaven will be yours. You must go through Jesus Christ. Muhammad, a little different. He didn't believe that it was his job to be resurrected. He would tell you that Christ, in fact, was resurrected. He would also say, it says in the Quran, that the crucifixion actually didn't happen. And it was a symbolic, there was a metaphorical, my interpretation of what I read was that there was a metaphorical reason why he said that. It wasn't a fact. He was basically saying that the purpose of Christ was to die for our sins and to be resurrected. The fact that this crucifixion happened was nothing more than a show for the Romans, at the time. That Christ, his mission was to die for our sins, and his mission was to go to heaven. And that would have happened irrespective of the crucifixion. So you can read that in the Quran, you can draw your own conclusions. I think he was speaking a lot more metaphorically, symbolically, but I can understand when a Christian reads that, it's almost an affront to our own religion, but I think it's just a matter of interpretation. And the point that Muhammad is trying to make is that the only important thing here is God. There is no God but God. That's it. All of these other things don't matter. You have to worship God directly. So I think that's what a conversation between Muhammad and Christ would be. I think that Christ would end up being the person who reached his hand out to shake his hand, and I think Muhammad may get down and do some push-ups or something before he shook his hand. A little bit more aggressive, a little bit more fiery, but I've got to tell you, I think both of them were key religious figures. I am obviously a Christian. I obviously believe in Christ. I believe that Christ died for our sins. And some of the things that I read in the Quran were a little bit in conflict to what I personally believe. But I think I've gotten to the point where I'm not offended by it just because I think I understand the intention behind what Muhammad was saying. So I think that concludes my class for today.
Thank you so much.